The Philippines, a past revisited. Chapter 12, The Second Coup. The Cuban Revolution paves the way of opportunity for the United States to impose its own rule in both Cuba and in the Philippines. Because of Cuban revolutionaries, American gets enough public indignation against Spain. American warship Maine was mysteriously exploded, resulting for the United States to declare war against Spanish. Within a month the American-Spanish War had erupted, and 6 days after its declaration, the Spanish fleet destroyed in the lead of Commodore George Dewey. Before the war between United States and Spain, Felipe Agoncillo suggested a Filipino-America alliance. Agoncillo proposed to the Americans to supply the Filipinos with arms and ammunition and promised to pay by pledging 2 provinces and the customs house at Manila, but the Americans rejected this offer. Aguinaldo believed in the words of the Americans and agreed in the alliance with the U.S. in order to throw out the Spaniards in the Philippines. The Americans made fools out of Filipinos by entering the scene just as Philippine independence is within reach. The foolish belief that if the Hong Kong junta cooperated with the Americans, the latter would transport the Filipinos' own arms and ammunition for free, and with these arms, the Filipinos would have a better chance of resisting the Americans should the latter decide to claim the Philippines. Despite Aguinaldo's misgivings regarding the American sincerity on helping the Filipinos, since the latter did not put any agreement in writing, he continued dealing with the U.S. Agoncillo's belief that Aguinaldo's return to the Philippines is necessary to prevent other ambitious leaders from fighting among themselves for preeminence. Historians have accepted Aguinaldo's view and treated the duration of the Hong Kong junta exile as a period of quiescence between the first and second phase of the revolution. Aguinaldo's pronouncements that continuing the fight against the Spaniards as banditry and not as rebellion, while the masses and their leaders continued the resistance without Aguinaldo. 4 major forces on the historical stage. Spanish colonialism, American imperialism, the Filipino Ilustrados, and the Filipino masses. The first 3 engaged in the series of interrelated maneuvers on furtherance of their own goals, which centered on securing control over the 4th entity, which is the masses. Spanish colonialism was avoiding its possible defeat with conciliatory move. American imperialism was waiting for its enough time to have a strong military forces in the area before moving on to its true plan. The Ilustrados' supposed goal was for independence, but long before they began to fight the Americans, they were already considering the possibility of accepting a protectorate or even annexation, just as they had been disposed to accept the continuation of Spanish rule after the Pact of Bayaquene-Bato. The Filipino masses were in a state of ignorance regarding American imperialism, since their supposed recognized leaders, the Ilustrados, were naive, opportunists and selfing. Spaniards commissioned the Ilustrados. Agustin assigned File Buencamino as an emissary to General Aguinaldo, offered Buencamino a higher position in Spanish government and Spanish army. Buencamino later revealed that he had instructed to offer Aguinaldo a high position in the Spanish army if he give his loyalty to the Spain and fight against American, but he rejected the offer. Pedro Paterno, negotiator of the Pact of Bayaquene-Bato, accepted the position as president of the Consultative Assembly given by the Spanish Governor-General. Other Ilustrados was also included in the Assembly as an advisory body. The Assembly was not effective and eventually ended without any achievement. Philippine independence from Spain was proclaimed by Aguinaldo on June 12, 1898, with the raising of the Philippine flag in Caet, Kavita, and the Philippine national anthem was first played in public. Mabini saw that the Declaration of Independence as premature since the participation of the people was lacking because it is made by the military and dictatorial government. This objection of Mabini was not considered. While the Filipino people continues with their anti-colonial war under different leaders, Aguinaldo once again proclaimed himself as a leader. Aguinaldo attracted many groups to be with him because of his connection to the Americans. On his self-proclaimed leadership, he demised the Biakene Bato Republic and its all orders, and all other resistance leaders as well. He made that all positions must be dependent on his personal appointment. From his proclamation of dictatorship to revolutionary government, Aguinaldo once again became the president and eventually appointed his first cabinet ministers for the establishing a full-blown republic on July 15. The Filipinos' determination finally yielded to become free under Spanish control. Americans kept a friendly relationship with Aguinaldo and his groups. Americans tricked the Filipino leaders by a friendly approach and acted with duplicity. American used the Filipino to fight the Spaniards until the American troops arrived. When the U.S. Army was fully equipped and ready to implement their plans, Americans began to treat their allies arrogantly and started demanding for surrendering Filipino troops areas to them. Despite the mounting evidence of American double-dealing and the increasingly clear indications of U.S. intentions, Aguinaldo continued to maintain a conciliatory attitude towards the Americans and publicly declare his faith in them. Aguinaldo's cabinet are composed of those who just recently been in the Spanish camp. The Revolutionary Congress in Barisoa, Malolos are composed of provincial and Manila elites who actually do not represent the Filipino people. After a many military war against Spain in different provinces in the country, the Spaniards eventually controlled only a few isolated outposts in the country. The Filipino people had won their war of liberation on their own without the help of a foreign power. While Filipinos was busy with the struggle, they did not pay much attention to the maneuvers of their leaders and did not perceive the real import of the Ilustrado takeover. After the Malolos Congress was convoked, a dispute arose between Apolinario Mabini and the leaders of Congress. It was all about whether or not Congress should frame a constitution. A draft of the constitution that Felipe Calderon prepared was approved, which the setup was a government republican in the form of legislature as the supreme branch. The constitution contained many provisions regarding the right of citizens and a provision for the union of state and church. The first Philippine Republic was inaugurated on January 23, 1899. Aguinaldo's first act was to pardon Spanish prisoners who was in the army of Spain and gave both Spanish and other foreigners the right to engage in business in the Philippines. While Aguinaldo's group was busied itself with establishing the framework of the central government, Americans gives incontrovertible signs to colonize the country. The American pronouncement of benevolent assimilation would be disclaimed by the eruption of the Filipino-American War starting February 4, 1899. Apolinario Mabini was ousted out of the Aguinaldo cabinet at the insistence of Pedro Paterno and Felipe Calderon, who care little for independence, and the Biakene Bato repeated. Insubordination and confusion among Filipino troops eventually caused Luna to resign as general, though he eventually returned to the army and Aguinaldo appointed him as a commander-in-chief for Central Luzon. On June 5, 1899, he was assassinated by physical force and stabbing by his own people, Filipino soldiers whom Luna had either insulted, arrested, or disarmed for insubordination. He received about 40 wounds. Luna's death said that it was caused by him insulting against the absent of Aguinaldo and accused that Luna was planning to take over the presidency from Aguinaldo. After Luna's death, the war was going badly for the Philippine side despite of several heroic resistance, and many of Luna's wide following began to surrender. Abuses of military and civilian officials and corruption were started in the administration. Because of these, people's support declined. By this time, the spirit of equality and brotherhood of Katipunan, which is the foundation of revolutionary virtue, had into empty rhetoric at the hand of the Ilustrados. The problem in the opportunism of the leaders became the factor to declining of the revolution and caused disappointment. Despite of these events, the enemy was still treated as friends and allies. After the Americans mounted a full scale of offense and its number arose, Aguinaldo and his group began to move from one place to another. The Tirad Pass battle, which engaged to the enemy to cover Aguinaldo's retreat, was resulted to General Gregorio del Pila's death. In their problematic journey, Aguinaldo even managed to wish and promise good things to his comrades. When they reached Palanan, Isabela, here they stayed over a few months. Their lives went easy here to the point that they can host a New Year's ball. The guerrilla warfare was very effective and the people were supporting them in all ways. While Aguinaldo was communicating to the guerrillas, one of his message reached General Frederick Funston and eventually make a plan on capturing Aguinaldo. The plan was to deceive Aguinaldo by which pro-American scouts dressing Rayadillo uniforms to pretend to be a personnel bringing 5 American prisoners to Palanan, and the trick was resulted to Aguinaldo being captured on May 23, 1901. Aguinaldo took his oath of allegiance to the U.S. and proclaimed to end the war and surrender to the Americans. He then became separated from the public and eventually denied to have any influence afterwards. Personal analysis. We therefore conclude that Aguinaldo's approach in his governance and his decision of alliancing in the U.S. was a kind of betrayal not only for the Filipino masses but in the whole country as well. Aguinaldo and his Ilustrados do manage to be friends with the Americans just to ensure their position in the government, while the masses still struggling and giving their own life just to achieve the long-awaited freedom and liberty. The self-interest, corruption, and abuse of the higher leaders prevailed, and this caused us Filipinos to fall under the Americans even though the Filipinos fought for their freedom with full force.